Now, what we'd like to do is take a few minutes now and drill down into some things that local board secretaries have asked us about. What we'd like to do now is bring up some of the training material that we've provided on the website and go through that. And the first one we'll bring up is going to come from our retirement instruction manual. As we've mentioned, there's 2 retirement instruction manuals, and most of the ones that you'll be looking at are for somebody who was hired before 1/1 of a certain date, 2012. This instruction manual, we're just going to kind of scroll through this so you can kind of see a process of how this is set up. Some of you might say, I've never seen this before. But if I was a local board secretary, this is the first place I would go to make sure I'd be able to do my duties as a local board secretary. So if you might look at that whole thing and say, now what exactly am I looking for here in this particular example? Let's click on one of the topics. Who has an interest in one of the topics that are on that agenda, first of all? Let's click on what? Normal retirement? Okay. So if we click on normal retirement, it gives you what the qualifications are. He needs to work 20 years, be 60 to 15 years of service. Corp has a checklist. And these are all the documentations or forms that you may need for that particular person to retire. And you can use that as a checklist going through as you're helping a person out. Okay, does that make sense? It's a very good instruction manual, and it'll be updated this September, actually, of 2014. So let's go back a page now and go back to the main menu. And you can see, how about what happens with an overview of the forms in the retirement package? Let's take a look at that. This is a great example to say what actually is compensation. What does a person need to have for contributions? Overview of the forms, what needs to be done. If the person's doing an application for a benefit, who submits that and who signs the paperwork? That's what this instruction manual helps you go through. So let's go down one more page. Retirement benefit calculation on Form 11. This form provides the details of how the benefit is calculated. So you can see it kind of breaks down all of the paperwork that needs to be submitted and the notifications. The notification of benefit, Form 12. Have any of you ever heard of Form 11 or Form 12 before? Okay, so Form 12 would give you the benefit type, the date of the first payment, and the monthly benefit amount. You might say, wow, this is overwhelming. How do I get to all of that information? Okay, well, what we've done is we've created in this instruction manual all of the information that comes up. Let's go ahead and go to navigating to the spreadsheet. So if you want to navigate to the spreadsheet, you can go to the website and you go to PSPRS.com, and a screen will come up and show you on the main menu on the drop down on the left hand side. So in other words, it tells you exactly what to do as you're going to find that spreadsheet. If we go down one more page, it'll step you through, scroll down to each of the different sections, how you find the spreadsheet and how to fill it out. Does that make sense? So it's kind of a detailed thing. So let's just go flip through the next 4 slides. There might be an Excel macro that you need to set up. Okay, there might be a download to your computer that you might need to do. So in other words, this instruction manual helps you go through the process. The next slide, please. So this is the beginning of the spreadsheet. It'll open up. Now, how many of you have actually seen this spreadsheet before? Okay, some of you have, some of you haven't. This is how you help retire somebody. Okay, so you open the spreadsheet up, and on this particular screen, you're going to put in their name and some static data to help them out to get ready to retire. And then you'll see down at the bottom there's a bunch of forms that we just talked about. Form 11, Form 12, all the things that you need to help that person retire. So that kind of help you understand how you get to the spreadsheet. You know, you can find it on the website, you click on it and you open it up. So now what we'd like to do is just scroll through the next 2 pages, page 16, and it goes through the deadlines to how to submit this paperwork. How about the health insurance that's available to the retirees? All of the information you'll ever need to know about a retirement package is listed there. So what we've done is we've actually created a spreadsheet that we'd like to open up now so you can see how this works. So if I was a local board secretary, the first thing I would go to is where? The retirement instruction manual. Read through the entire thing, peruse it, kind of get familiar with how that works. Now, we put together this particular this particular spreadsheet to give you an example. So in the instruction manual, it tells you to go create one of these spreadsheets. So we've created one here for you today, and now you can look at it. The first thing I want you to see is today's date and the date the person may want to retire, and the personal information. Joe retire, he wants to get out. What's his birth date? Is he male, married? His spouse information, and where the person may live. So this is just static data. Does that make sense? Now at the bottom you may have children that will be listed. Now the thing I want you to understand, once you fill out the spreadsheet, you may want to save that off onto your computer so you'll have that if there's any additional changes like bank information or anything else that comes in later on for the retiree. Now what happens if the person, do you see the radio boxes right in the middle? It says normal retirement. This is how you'd create a normal retirement. What happens if you clicked on accidental disability? Everything at the bottom of the spreadsheet would then change so it would become a disability application. What happens if you want to do a surviving spouse or designated beneficiary? Everything on the spreadsheet would change. Does that make sense? Okay. So this spreadsheet is set up so you can do just about everything, which you can do, to submit the paperwork that's in the retirement instruction manual. So if we go back to a normal retirement for just a minute, you kind of saw how it all jiggles around and brings up the new information. Let's go ahead and scroll down on the actual retirement spreadsheet for just a minute. And you might say, what about the retirement employee information? This is particularly the place you might be retiring from. You'd put in the years of service from January 1st, 1990 when the person started to September 30th when he actually is getting ready to retire. You may look at his compensation area, and we'll get into the more detail about this in a minute. He worked from September 1st, 2010 through 2013, and he had an average of a high 3 years. You'd put that information in there. Now you might ask yourself, where do you get that information? There's two places. Usually you go to the payroll group and that local board portal website we were just talking about, which we'll get into in just a minute, to calculate and find that information. It helps you determine what the compensation would be. Perhaps somebody might have leave without pay, or they might have prior service. Where is that information found? The local board portal. It has all that information stored there. The industry, perhaps he might be on industrial leave. The payment information, a direct deposit, it might go to Chase Bank. You may need the bank routing number, all the information there. Now the important thing I want you to see here is who's the beneficiary too. You'd want to put in perhaps the wife or whoever the person may have. And then you'd put down at the bottom, these forms are prepared by a certain person. So does that kind of make sense how that's done? And when your board meeting that you actually had your meeting on, because all of this spreadsheet now is filled out, and if you go to the actual information down at the bottom, as you can probably see here, it brings up one of the forms. What is a P4 form? This is telling you the person is getting ready to retire and some static data about the individual. Okay, so P form, you need to provide certain information off of that. See, if you had leave without pay, it would fill it in the spreadsheet. That makes sense? Okay, let's go to the next form. That's the P4. This is where the primary beneficiary information is at, designation of who the person would be paid, and the person's name and social security number would come up there, plus the person who would be getting the benefit as well if that person passed away, the primary beneficiary. That's the Form 8. If you go to the next spreadsheet and you click at the bottom, it'll bring up the next form, and that's the Form 11. And we talked about this one just a minute ago. This is where it actually says this guy worked for 24 years and his date of birth. All that information is brought across from the spreadsheet, the input sheet that we put up there. Now it's important that you see there on line 17, amount of final contribution. we need to know that you've actually paid that person all the way through to his retirement date. Okay, we get a lot of forms sometimes where they stop the payment on the 25th, but the guy retires on the 30th. So what do you think we have to do? You have to get more contributions because it has to be the last day in which they actually retired. That makes sense? Okay. So I don't know why some boards, they say, well, payroll stopped. Well, no, the payroll has to go through the date in which they actually retired. So you can see on Form 30, it calculates his benefit of $2,700, but because he had additional service on this, he gets a little bit more money, so he gets about a $3,300 pension. Because it takes the high 3 years on 26, divides it out to a monthly amount, and then calculates it for you. Isn't that nice? It's a wonderful spreadsheet to be able to calculate. And this will be done for a disability. All that's done the same way. So let's go into Form 12. This is very important that we see Form 12. This is where the benefits are actually calculated, what he actually will get on line 17, line 18, the dollar amount, what his spouse would get, a surviving spouse. And it comes from again, the local board met on that particular date, and you're able to submit the paperwork. Okay? And then the next form would be a tax Form 13. This is a direct deposit form for somebody that may want their check automatically put in their bank account, which we encourage everybody to do. So you can see by clicking on each of those forms at the bottom, what does it do? It provides all the paperwork that's in the instruction manual for you to actually be able to use. All right, and the next form would come up, and this is again Form 16. This needs to be signed and acknowledged and initialed in each of those spots. The member has to say, I agree to these work guidelines. I'm not coming back to work. It's a return to work document. This is new based off the law that was passed recently, Form 16. They're acknowledging that I'm done. I'm not coming back to work usually within a year with that agency. And the next form would be the tax forms. This is a W-4P. Now, you can see the top portion helps you calculate it, but the bottom portion is what we actually need to see. See how Joe retiree comes in? Joe retired, his address, and in this situation, he's married with 2 dependents, he and his wife. Does that make sense? So you can see that all the tax forms are filled out. Now, a lot of times, the member forgets to sign this. Now, can we take taxes out if he doesn't sign it? No. So you got to look at each of the forms that are submitted and make sure taxes are taken out, or each of the forms are submitted with the signature and the date. And the last form here is the Arizona withholding. He only wanted 1.8% of his retirement check taken out for state taxes. That has to be marked and also signed. Okay? And that kind of gives you a flavor of what needs to be done. So if we go back to the first, the retirement input sheet, is there anybody that has any problem with filling out the first section there? Pretty easy. It's static data. All the information is available. Now let's go down a little bit because we want to go back to one of the sections here where it comes to the salary, the compensation area. This is where a lot of local board secretaries get very confused how to fill this out. How do you find the high 3 years in that particular situation? Well, the first place to start is your payroll records, and you'd look at it and say, well, we think it's about 150,000, 200,000 for a high 3 years. Okay? Now, if you sign into the local board portal, then you'll be able to calculate that against what we have in our database. So let's go to that for just a minute, and we'll come back to this, and this is where you get the information from. As we talked about the compensation, because all the other information is pretty much should be at your fingertips. The day he's retiring, what his service dates are. Now, what happens if you don't know what the service dates are? What do? You go to the local board portal, you look it up. It says the start date and when the end date, it helps calculate. It should be right in the same. We actually get paperwork in the office that says, no, the guy started on September 5th, 2010, And their database says, no, September 1st, 2010. Now what do we have to go with? What we have in the database, unless you have records otherwise. That's one of the common things that comes into the office. They don't compare it to what we have in our database with your records to make sure it's submitted properly the first time. You should get all that resolved prior to submitting any paperwork or any spreadsheets. Okay? Now, the compensation area is very important. We talked about how to find the high 3 years is using the local board calculator, using payroll records. It's really important that you put the final contribution to PSPRS and the dollar amount and the pay period ending, and it has to be the date of retirement. It can't be before or after. It has to be working through that date. And if you don't have contributions for him, what happens? Our office has to say, whoops, we don't have it on record, we can't pay the guy. Okay? That's one of the common things that happens. So if you're looking at the P11, as we talked about, all that data is brought over, and as some of the things that we don't see is the membership date might be off, the prior service might be off, leave without pay might be off, or the total service might be off. If those things are off, you need to find out why, but you can always compare it to the local board website, and it will tell you why it's off. Does that make sense? The P11, also the retirement date and the final contributions, as we talked about, always has to go through the member's retirement date. This is reflection on all the pages we just looked at on the website here. So if you need to find the history for the pay periods, it's better to look it up first and then try to put something in and guess at it later. The P12, oftentimes the member's initials are not on it, and there's not signatures available, and perhaps the local board secretary perhaps didn't look at all the paperwork before they submitted it. That's a common thing that happens. And guess who gets the short end of that? The member. Because we can't pay them unless their signatures are on all the paperwork. So it's better to just flip through each page, make sure you've signed it, the board chairman signed it, all the information is there. Also, the W4P, as we talked about, the member completes the bottom of the form, and it has to be completed all the way through. If that information is not there, we can't take any taxes out, and then we get a call. As we talked about, Form 16, all the items need to be initialed by the member, and the bottom of the form needs to be completed as well. So it's interesting that each of the forms P5, the local board needs to sign and date those when they've received the application, because then we know that the application's been submitted and then sent forward. The P5 also, whether it's an ordinary, temporary, or catastrophic, all of the different questions need to be answered on the spreadsheet to make sure the member knows what kind of application they've applied for. So if you go back to the spreadsheet, you can see all of this is calculated off the input sheet. Now what happens if we did find an error, and let's just go back to his service date for just a minute. Okay? Let's just say the error's been found and he didn't start on September 1st. It's under the retire employment information. There we go. Let's see. Oops, right there. He actually started January 1st, 1985. Okay? Let's just say there's a big error. We've typed it in wrong. We click on that. Now let's go over to the P11 so you can see what difference it makes in the calculation. It has the same average monthly compensation. It now moves it down from Part D to Part E, and you can see now that he gets a higher benefit. Before it was calculated at $3,300. Now it's calculated at $4,131, because as you can see he has 29 years of service, which is a higher benefit to the individual. Does that make sense? So you got to make sure those dates are correct before you actually print all the paperwork and agree that that's what's happened. All right, so that kind of concludes this section to help us understand why the spreadsheet is so easy to change. Make sure you save it off, and you have that for each retiree that's going through the process. We appreciate the attendance today. Again, the active members, the Don's Group, can help you with all those transfer things you were talking about. And Bonnie's group can always help you with any retired members' information about insurance. So we appreciate you coming today. Is there any other questions at this time? If not, thank you for attending.